Hello. So I'd like to introduce this episode with Daniel Simpson. Really enjoyed talking with him. We discussed topics around discovering potential in the world and how we can sort of create more possibility of that. Daniel is the author of The Truth of Yoga. This is his second appearance. He actually was my first guest almost a year ago. So it was really nice to have him back, sort of reflect on this crazy year. And Daniel also brought some insights from his yoga philosophy about being in the world when it's beyond your control. Aside from this, please do check out the Culture Pilgrim Substack. I'll be posting a new piece hopefully today, and I hope you enjoy the conversation.
It's been a bit of a year.
You were the first guest of SenseSpace. You were so early on that SenseSpace didn't have its name yet.
And I think you were still in the UK then, weren't you? Or were you in Greece? I can't remember.
Yes, I was in Bournemouth.
That's right.
On a 3-month stint staying with my godparents. So we really caught each other at the beginning of a year of moving around every 3 months for me, which has ended up miraculously with being here in Berlin and moving in with my girlfriend. So
it's a very nice outcome to the itinerant phase.
To the existential challenge, yeah. So I mean, we talked in March. What stands out for you straight off the bat as you sort of look back in the period of time that's occurred since we last spoke?
Well, there have been a lot of challenges. I mean, as somebody who talks about yoga philosophy for a living, I've particularly been challenged to, dig deep. If these topics are worth talking about, then they should be able to help us face adversity of all kinds right here, right now. And a lot of what I have been doing is talking about yoga philosophy in a very abstract way, training yoga teachers for old text day, or running courses, talking about the evolution of practices over the centuries. It's all very interesting intellectually, but it's one stage removed from the here and now. Suddenly, pretty soon after we spoke in March, I found myself hosting groups where people were just saying, I'm freaking out. and I was trying to say, well, there are these ideas that we've all been talking about when we've been thinking about yoga philosophy, and some of them are actually related to this, to the problem of the world is not as I would like it to be. It's beyond my control, and there is actually no easy way out of this conundrum. And we talked a little bit in passing in our correspondence about the Bhaghavad Gita, and that's a text that's set in that situation. It starts on the battlefield with a warrior not wanting to go ahead with what he's tasked with doing. And I think, for a lot of people, this past 12 months has been a bit like that. You find yourself in some not particularly desirable set of circumstances with no apparently good outcome in sight, and somehow got to make some progress with it all, and not just sort of collapse on the couch and fill yourself with whatever the chosen poison is. And I think in a way, as I say, that was a challenge for me, because I was feeling a bit that way myself. I didn't know whether I'd be able to make a living. A lot of what I do is 0 hours contract, classic gig economy work, and the gigs could very easily all have dried up. So I felt this need to be online all the time, talking all the time, trying to make sure there were still things to do. All the things I had been planning, like going on a yoga retreat with a group to Portugal, obviously went out the window. So I guess I had to, figure out for myself what it was I was going to focus on. And that coincided with work to bring out a book that I've been writing for the past couple of years, which is about the yoga philosophy that I've been talking about, and also the history of yoga. And I guess the two things started to just sort of combine. My life and yoga philosophy, and talking about yoga philosophy for a living became philosophizing as a way of life in order to figure out, my own existential circumstances and how to keep going in the midst of it all. I live by myself in the middle of nowhere. It's been quite isolating, and yet I've been glued to a screen with my forehead increasingly merging with the webcam. So it's been a challenge from that point of view as well, to sort of step back and say enough tech, even if that is a means of connection. So lots been going on. How about you?
Yeah, that's clicking a lot with aspects of my last year as well. I'm curious. Before I share about the isolation, are you in the countryside, or like where are you?
Yeah, I'm northwest of Oxford, so it's technically what's known as the Cotswolds, although that conjures up for other people, very pretty little cottages and very rich celebrities, and there's not so many of those where I am. I'm kind of on a windswept field on which some houses have been built, but it's peaceful and there's lots of nature around, and it's been a good place to be locked down from that point of view. There's a little village shop and not a lot else, so. Get to spend some time, communing with my surroundings, and the basics are right here on the doorstep, so can survive without having to go anywhere. But otherwise, it's the kind of place where you've got to get in the car, or there's maybe one or two buses. It's not very well plugged in, like being in central London or New York, two places I've been recently living. So there's an adjustment. Suddenly, I got used to coming here as a bolt hole in between doing other things. It's just a great place to hole up and write, or to prepare to teach workshops or retreats. And suddenly that's all it was. So it was an adjustment, definitely.
Wow. Yeah, I was sort of feeling into that vibe of the country roads with little bus stops on them and just absolute quiet and desertion.
And that was lovely in March. Things really did shut down for a couple of months at the end of March, and there were just no cars on the roads. You could walk down the middle of what's ostensibly sort of a main road around here, and there was nothing on it. Now we're technically locked down again, but a lot of people out and about doing stuff all the time, and I kind of miss those early days of nobody knew what was happening. People were kind of freaking out, and yet we were all making sense of it. This collective project of trying to make sense of things has taken some fascinating twists as well over the past 12 months. A lot of strange sense making gone on in relation to the virus and the sort of political circumstances and what may or may not be done around those. And the yoga teacher world has been very caught up in delusional fantasies, to be quite honest, QAnon, etc. And it's been fascinating to watch that, and also to watch people try to take it on and see how very difficult it is to argue with conspiracy theories. They just sort of they grow to accommodate the challenge as part of the problem, and no amount of disproving them will work. People get ever more insulated in this bubble of self-confirming bias.
Yeah.
In that with familiarity, thinking, I've certainly sat in a few of those little corners at times in my life, thinking, I know the secrets of the universe. I don't think the real secrets of the universe are that secret. They're almost blindingly obvious. We just do our best to avoid seeing them in the face.
Something about rediscovering the local was really salient for me at the beginning, and it felt like although during that year I had kind of been I was basically on exodus or pilgrimage or something from my experience, and not being in a home that I was situated in and sort of moving around. And there was something about rediscovering just like where I am. When I was in Bournemouth, that meant going onto a local golf course, which had a bit of a forest in the middle of it, and I would just go out and dwell in there at great length. And then I managed to get out to Greece sort of not long after we spoke and hide out in my parents' flat. So a lot of climbing up on hills and looking out into the horizon, and the absence of airplanes and everything really contributed to that. And it was also a weird experience to be sort of plugged into like, alternative sense making world. And in that moment, in those initial weeks where everybody was losing their minds, and my parents were like somehow mustering up like World War II cultural memories and like buying all like bags and loads of flour and porridge oats and stuff. It felt like these skills of these more sort of preparatory skills, I guess, and these sense-making networks seemed to be much more ahead of the game of what was coming. And I definitely found the demand for like wisdom time and time again during that period of just like, intense stressful times in the flat with my parents, or after that, since coming here to Berlin, just really being in a continuous flow of change. It's felt like, thankfully with a directionality of healing, which has been awesome, but certainly the process of changing a pattern seems to be to repeat it again and again and be given opportunities to face the scenario, in which you can then at some late stage perceive it differently and like make a move that was novel that you didn't know was possible, and suddenly you've stepped into a new life in doing that.
Very good way of putting it. Is a story one of my teachers likes to tell, which is some sort of hodgepodge of Eastern wisdom stories, I guess, of walking along a road and falling into a pothole. And a guy does this again and again and again until he realizes that it's possible to walk around the pothole. And I haven't told it with all of the drama that one could string it out with, but effectively it's that simple. We keep walking into a hole without realizing that there's sort of a perimeter to the hole, and we don't have to fall over the edge of it. We could skirt it instead. But often there's nothing other than the path, and we're walking the path and we keep falling in the hole instead of realizing that if we just broadened our perspective, there's something past the hole. And it's very hard to see that sometimes. Our mind's conditioned in grooves. So to make sense of reality, I think we go mad if we weren't filtering out most of the information available to us. Otherwise it'd be like one continual psychedelic meltdown.
Yeah, there's something in that about like, what are those ways of being that can free up this space and movement? And obviously, yoga's gonna come up, but I've been sort of exploring a broader notion of this, the name of which my girlfriend came up with is a metta practitioner. And the idea behind that was, what is the way of being that sort of sits in relationship to a multiplicity of different practices, with an expanded notion of what practice is, to include not just meditation and yoga, but music, dance, walking in nature, bits and bobs from circling and authentic relating and how you communicate. And how you approach sex and everything, and more, all of which seems to serve to create more space for, so I don't know, like perceiving potential in the sort of field of possibility that we live in. And you've just written a book. I believe it's called The Truth of Yoga. I might be wrong. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, there it is. It's not an unambitious title. Yeah, it's not a very thick book either. So there's a lot one could say about yoga and certainly about truth, and it's impossible to condense it all into a little book like that. But I've had a go at trying to summarize some ideas. And I suppose the truth of yoga is we're not what we think, and what we think is often the enemy of actually knowing stuff, because the mind likes to parcel things up into packages that are very familiar and then just sort of rearrange them in preconceived order, the patterns we were talking about. So the mind just sort of goes around in grooves, and yoga, as traditionally conceived, was a way of stepping outside of that and ultimately outside of conventional existence, and using techniques of training the mind and the body, so that it would ultimately be possible to ignore both, or at least not have them make unanswerable demands on us. And obviously a lot of that gets lost in the way that yoga and meditation are presented today, especially with the sort of, I was going to say dumbing down. It doesn't need to be dumbed down, but the sort of distillation of Buddhist meditation wisdom into something like an 8-week mindfulness course that often is just about feeling a little bit more comfortable in one's own skin, a little bit more able to tolerate some of the stresses of life. But then obviously that can make it much easier to be required to remain within the structures that are really stressful. And I think originally these teachings were designed to sort of rip up all structures completely. And ultimately that leads to a phase of total renunciation of conventional life, which is not what most of us are looking for. So I've tried to write about the historical evolution from that birthplace of these ideas to where we are now. And obviously, therefore, we're watering these things down in some way or form, inevitably by not going all the way, as it were. But all the way is quite austere, and I think not very compatible with 21st century lifestyles. And I think it's possible to maintain some connection to the spirit of that project in a way that is a little bit more householder friendly, rather than for the cave dweller. So I think I've just been trying to point through writing the book to the common threads, so that people can find their own way, really, of mixing their own cocktail of these bits and pieces from tradition that really speak to us still now. But it's impossible really to take a text from 2,000 years ago and feel this is my blueprint for living, because the people it was written for are living a very different life, and we can't really approach that in any meaningful way unless we do step right back from, it's not just a question of not being online, it's not really being involved with relationships. And that's the difference. I think most people who practice yoga and meditation now are trying to make it, as you were describing, part of a way of relating, not just to the moment and to ourselves, but to each other and society as as productively as possible. And that's not really described in these old texts. In fact, it's discouraged by most ancient yoga teachers. That's the source of the problem, to be involved with society and each other. The Yoga Sutra of Patanjali is really clear. It says you should practice meditation on the body from the point of view of seeing how it can never be clean, therefore it's disgusting. You should therefore desire no contact with anybody else's body, and you should aspire to give up your own, which is that's pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
Back to the modern era.
Well, to just riff on that a little bit, there's a number of interesting sort of dialectics or tensions it sounds like you hold in the book or in your relationship to these ideas. one of those is, and something that I also noticed when I read the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, was that sort of, there was definitely a tone coming through of emphasis on self-control and self-restraint, which was interesting. And then there's also a sort of tension, like in your articulation of yoga and meditation, you really allude to something much more radical. And in reading the Gita, I get a sense of the depth of what that is. And yet, somehow you seem to be putting forward something very radical, but in a way that feels very calm and reasonable. And I don't know if I left the book in the kitchen. Anyway, I was struck by the amount of similarities, I guess, for me, between reading the Gita and my sort of interpretation of the Jesus Christ story. Seemed to be a lot of correspondence in the character of Krishna as kind of the God self embodied in form. Yeah, there was so much there that felt to me like a sort of similar message.
I think you're right, and it's a really striking archetype, and I think in some ways that also struck early British colonialists when they started looking at these ancient Indian texts. The Gita was one of the first texts, may even actually have been the first, if scratching away in the bowels of my memory, but I think the late 18th century, the Gita was first translated into English, and it was clearly identified as sort of the Hindu Bible from that point of view. It seemed very familiar. There is, sort of God who descends to earth in this embodied form and yet is somehow beyond the world. And yet the Gita makes it all, very psychedelic as well. I mean, literally Krishna is the world, sort of pulsating in everything, and reveals himself in the 11th chapter of the Gita in this really trippy, psychedelic freak out to Arjuna, who's on his knees begging him to stop, and that's a scene that was conjured up into the mind of Robert Oppenheimer watching the test of the first nuclear bomb, and sort of imagining this kind of embodiment of what Krishna calls time, really, but I am become death was the way that Oppenheimer brought it to mind. This sort of immense omnipotent power to destroy everything and to create it, and just to be, that's what time is, it eats everything up, and it's what confuses us, this idea that we can somehow step outside of it, this whole project of planning. I mean, I'm caught up in this a lot myself. It's just the nature of life, and I'm a bit that way, but there is only now. Everything else is tomorrow and yesterday, and doesn't exist until it's now. So all the time that we're projecting forwards or backwards, we're not in the moment, and time's eating up our life. There really is only this moment that we're in. We can make the most of it. We can plan about things to do in the next moment. But so Krishna is sort of somehow standing outside of time. He is time, and the message is that there's a way to become him, almost, depending on how you read the Gita. And that's a lot more cosmic than certainly what's put into the conventional reading of the New Testament. You could, although in some ways, the kingdom of heaven is within, and all those messages are there. And a lot of Indian teachers, Yogananda, in his autobiography of a yogi, he goes sort of through a lot of Indian very mystical teachings and draws parallels with passages from the Bible in order to show Americans that there are these connections, and there is something that cosmic buried away in Christian tradition. And Christian mystics have obviously found their own way to that project, but it seems to have been stamped on by the church, because institutions, certainly in the Western world, are not very keen on the kind of person that Christ seems to have been, sort of anarchist sadhu wandering around stirring people up with inspiring messages. That's not very conducive to people controlling things, which is generally what religions like to do.
Yes. Yes, I'm feeling the Daniel Simpson classic flavor now, sort of coming through. There was something very, sort of iconic going on in our first call that, I don't know, I think both of our English heritage maybe is part of the degree of resonance about this. Yes, death, the destroyer of worlds, and revealing himself to Arjuna. There's this scene in which it's described as envisioning like 1,000 rising suns or 10,000 rising suns. And that was the one that really like lit me up, like lit up my third eye, like sort of popped me briefly into a possibility space, which is sort of the space that I imagine to be there based on accounts of DMT trips that people have. Anyway, that's a bit of a sidetrack. But,
I don't know if it is. I mean, that brings us actually back to where we were before I went down the rabbit warren of yoga history. I mean, you were talking about sort of walking around with this sense of possibility, and that's always there. And I guess that was what I was alluding to with this description of the problem of time. And in some ways, time seems to suggest possibility, this planning forwards into projects. And yeah, I mean, writing my book was about that. I had to structure it in that way, otherwise I wouldn't have ever got it written. I would have drifted off with my propensity to be distracted into 101 other projects. But at the same time, this projection forwards robs us sometimes of possibility, because we miss what's actually there. So we're back into the single-minded focus and the inability to see past the pothole. Instead, it's very easy to get, and I see it, in my own mindset. I mean, I guess one thing that comes up when you're sort of, I guess, struck by certain resonances in what I say is, I tend to be motivated by extremes in my life. I've gone from one extreme to another, and as I've got older, found a way of integrating sort of the two extremes and spending most of my time between them rather than being pulled to one or the other. But I do tend to have this sort of vision that's always looking to the extremes and trying to marry them somehow. So whether it's the extreme of the intensity of ancient yoga practice and the sort of extreme of modern hyper-connected techno lifestyles, and trying to find some way to marry them. And I think in the end, the real world is all about beyond this sort of tension between anything. It just is. It doesn't need to be dissected into that. The potential is to just be in it, and that's where the unlimited possibilities are. As soon as one's pulled into sort of this binary of this or that, and then trying to find the midpoint, then it sort of flattens this thing that's got so many dimensions and put it into this sort of very linear plane. And I notice that tendency in myself, and it pulls me in unhelpful directions. And I find the most productive things happen when I don't even notice that they're there. They just sort of arise, and it's like a no-brainer. But the extent to which I'm planning and trying to balance the extremes is the extent to which I miss those opportunities. So I'm trying in this moment, when I've been very busy, to, especially over this last year, to still try and leave a bit of space for possibility to bubble up and surprise me. And life's very boring unless it surprises us, to be honest.
Yeah, the feeling of like, I think everybody experiences possibility to varying degrees in their lives, but then I think there's a landscape of like possibility that alludes to more possibility, or something like a sort of feedback loop sort of relationship, where leaning into one possibility opens up more possibilities, or something like that. And a lot of what I've been learning about since we last spoke in March 2020 has been this process of dialectic, and the possibility that can arise from that, of like a dialogos, of a kind of flow state, where we don't actually know what's going on. And I have experienced myself go through that transition since I came into the call, of like, for a period of time, there's sort of like the narrative of my idea of who you are in my head and what would probably talk about and what would be relevant to this. And then at some point, I'm no longer able to hold on to any of that. And I'm just tracking and being with you and trusting that when you finish speaking, that the next thing's going to come and sort of correspond with what came before. And so it's a real participating with not knowing somehow that you can find in this. And I feel in the sort of life, the conversation of your life between these extremes is somewhere in between that particular tension is the space that is the possibility space of growth, somewhere between narrative and experience, dropping into the body and dropping out of future projection and into the present, and then popping back into planning, thinking, narrative constructing, model building mode, and then popping back into the liquid. And that popping in and out seems to be affording of more flow. And that, I think, is something to do with the union of yoga.
I mean, I think the word that you identified, that sort of the Gita suggested to you, which is very strongly apparent in early teachings on yoga, of restraint, is a very important one. And it's the downside of yoga, and yet it's also the source of its power. This attempt to discipline ourselves and get everything under control. And all of the early teachings in yoga, I mean, the first ever definition of yoga in a text is a restraint of the mind and the senses. And Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra talks about stilling the movements of the mind, basically getting it all under control. And that's sort of the enemy of this flow state. And yogis were interested in this flow state in that sense, whereas the Gita was trying to say, how can you combine restraint with action? How can you actually live in the world without all of these mental projections getting in the way of productive activity? And the context of the story obviously is designed to put this philosophy forward. There's somebody who has an unpleasant task to do and he refuses to do it, and he somehow needs to get out of his own way and get on with it. And that leads to all sorts of interesting questions anyway, because basically the text turns into 18 chapters of war propaganda. The aim is for Krishna to persuade Arjuna to pick up his weapons and go into battle and kill his relatives. So that's it's a fairly funky story, and yet that's teaching him the highest wisdom. So there's that complication encountering it in the 21st century. Often from a lot of people come to yoga with a fairly sort of committed idea of themselves as progressive minded or against war, or certainly against harming, and to find that this is a text about battle, and that the ultimate sort of expression of yoga wisdom is to allow yourself to commit righteous harm. It's a bit challenging, and maybe better we put that one aside just for now. But from the point of view of learning how to act, this ability to bring the clarity that comes from the restraint into a dynamic interrelationship with other things, other beings, other situations, that's where yoga gets interesting for me. And that's, I suppose, what I'm trying to open myself up to more, and have had to through the teaching I've been doing. And I used to teach more about what yoga is in these old texts, and I always found the Bhagavad Gita, for the reasons I've just articulated, plus the God thing, a little bit difficult to integrate. And suddenly this year it's become my favorite text. It seems to talk about this challenge of how to be a yogi and yet live in the world. And the only real way to do it is to stop being hung up on this endless project of self-satisfaction, trying to get all the things we want, realizing that actually most of that's beyond our control. And that's what sort of frees up the mind to become a helpful tool rather than the master of the show. And my mind likes to try and plan and arrange, and if I can get everything organized well enough, then nothing will go wrong, and then immediately reality confounds me. And the case of my book being an immediate example. It's got an American publisher. It came out as planned on January the 5th in America, and it's still unavailable in the UK thanks to Brexit snarling up the ports, and a load of books that were imported back late last year, supposed to be here in good time, just didn't get here. So they've started to go out. People had pre-ordered. They're getting their books. And part of me was freaking out. I want to arrange something different, and I can't. It's totally beyond my control. And this year's been good for that sort of reminder. Many things that, sure, you can get pissed off, but that's not going to help. And it's good just to remember that no amount of planning or preparation counts, really. I mean, it's all doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but it doesn't make the outcome any more likely to be the one that we want. And for a very sort of analytically Germanic type of mind as the one I have, that's a confronting message. It likes to imagine that it can put in a lot of investment in systematization that will be flawless and engineer the right outcome, and it might make things more likely, but right now in this moment the odds remain 50-50. Absolutely no way of knowing. It might work out, might not. And I think the possibility of accepting that makes it much easier just to do stuff. Do a bit of planning, do a bit of preparation, it's all worth it. But as soon as we're hung up on will I get what I want, then game over from the point of view of keeping the flow going, because we get then unhappy when things don't go our way, or things arrive that we didn't ever want or expect. And that's what the Buddha was always trying to say. That's the whole problem of life. Is very simple. It's things we don't want happen, and we don't get what we want. And as long as we're caught up in that game, we'll be miserable.
Yeah, a deeply Buddhist message there, I felt, reflecting back on it.
And that's what the Gita does, really. It takes the Buddha's teachings, combines them with yoga, and turns it into, this is what people who live in the world can do. And it's a really, I mean, from a sort of historical, critical, analytical perspective, it's a very skillful act of cultural appropriation in that sense. It takes all the popular teachings that were big, bestsellers in 2,000 years ago in India, and sort of remixes them into this package that allows Brahmin priests to carry on sitting around, being in charge of things. That's part of what it does politically. I mean, it shores up the caste system by saying everyone should do their duty and act without attachment to results, and you shouldn't wish to be somebody else or to have their life. You should just do your thing, and that's your job. And so this metaphor of the soldier doing what he needs to do because he's born into that is the one for, don't try and change your social status. And that's also quite challenging to take on board. Yoga is political. I mean, it's always been involved with some sort of social context, and it's impossible to get away from that. But then I guess that, to me, in this last year has led me to wonder, especially as people have been coming and asking in these sort of workshops that I've been running online, what does yoga say about what to do right now? And I found myself increasingly not wanting to answer. I don't think there is an answer. My answer is almost always these days, it's up to us. Do what you think's right, but try and at first just see it for what it is. And it's very hard to see the world as it is. And I think that's what these practices help us to do, just to try and see a bit more clearly, see how much baggage we're bringing into the situation that stops us seeing it clearly. Sometimes psychedelics are a much more effective way of doing that, because they just cut through all, you can't maintain the illusions, they're dripping through your fingers.
Yeah, and absolutely, in certain ways, though I would say with over the longer track of experience with psychedelics and cannabis and other things, the capacity to drop in seems to be loosened and require less of those catalysts. And one of the exciting things I started doing since we last spoke was I started a meditation series called Dropping In. and just sort of like not scripted, just sort of meditating myself, to telling my own lullaby of dropping in and exploring, but doing it aloud. And I think there's something, there's not something, there's everything in what's present and not revealed. And something that I really wanted to appreciate about you and what you said was, you said the Gita like is grounded in the reality of experience. Like, you're here, you're in the situation, what do you do? And it's also a conversation, which I think is also important. It's like the conversational nature of life. But then you shifted to talking about your own experience, which you also do. And that is another, like, you're sort of mirroring that move almost by showing people, like, it's not just about the book or the script or the doctrine. It's about to bring it back to your own experience. And that's sort of what I look for in a teacher, in a wise person, in the kind of being, the kind of meta practitioner that I described. Like, what is the kind of personing and world being that can respond to this context now and be best responsive to it? I think it's someone who can make that move of dropping into the present and constantly moving between their narratives and experiences, and holding the conversation in themselves, and then understanding that sort of scales outward. Something about scaling I would love to, I don't know if that resonates for you, but I've been thinking a lot about branching patterns in nature over the course of the last year, and sort of drawing on those to inform my thought. And I think there's something perhaps of spiritual value in there, in respect that these branching patterns, are in our bodies and in our minds and the actual tissue, but then trees and rivers and I wonder if that's sort of, there's something visually, metaphorically reflective coming back to the experience of nature that then is leading us back to that participation with, where, sort of the stack of chakra things are in alignment.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things that's struck me in my experience with yoga was I began a very physical approach. I used to take Iyengar yoga classes, very obsessed with where you put your body. BKS Iyengar in his lifetime used to say that alignment is enlightenment, as if you could just sort of get everything perfectly arranged, and that would just somehow join everything up, light you up like a Christmas tree, and there'd be nothing left to do. And I once saw him teaching in China, and he had a metaphor that he liked to reach for, and he was sort of on this, this kind of retirement tour, last Swan Song international trip, 2011, stood up on a stage, held up a leaf, and he was trying to say, this leaf is perfect symmetry. Nature produces this beautiful symmetry. He was standing there in Tadasana, standing up straight, arms by the sides. He was getting all of these senior teachers, some of whom had studied with him for 40 years, and asking them to demonstrate. And there were 1,000 Chinese in this sports hall, and there was sort of on big screens being videoed. And he just kept picking holes in all of these students' postures, saying, you're not perfectly aligned, blah, blah, blah. And the more I sort of reflected on this, I thought, well, first of all, I've never seen a leaf in nature which is absolutely uniformly balanced from one side to the other. And secondly, here's BKS Iyengar standing in Tadasana, and if you look very closely, one of his hands is a little bit out of alignment, and there's all sorts of different shapes that go on. The two sides of the body are not the same. That's just the nature of things. And he's got a kink in his wrist, and I remember being told off by an Iyengar teacher in a room with that on the wall once, get your wrist straightened out. And I said, but he's not doing it. Yes, he is. And I said, look at it. Black is white, war is peace, ignorance is strength. And I don't know. I think nature is a great reminder of the impossibility of this project, to which I've always been drawn, trying to think one's way to the answer. Thinking's very helpful, but one has to feel. And I think in the moment, when it really comes down to that, this dropping in I really like is the body has a lot of wisdom in it. A lot of intellectual processing takes place there. I mean, this phrase we have, gut instinct, is often sort of ridiculed as folk wisdom, but I think the body knows a lot more than the mind a lot of the time. And if we can listen to it, then the mind can be very, helpful way of processing that and figuring out what to do. It's not like the gut is always right. It just has a feeling, and that needs interpreting. But I know that the times that I've ignored those feelings have generally led me into situations that I've had to reflect I could have avoided, because I knew before I started where this was leading. And all these ideas I have in my mind often just don't come true. So the mind's no better a guide anyway. So it's something much subtler in relating to the moment that can give us pointers. And ultimately, that's what the Gita is really trying to provide us. Really, it's this blueprint for figuring out what to do. And there isn't a fixed answer. And at the very end of it, sort of 15 verses from the end, Krishna tells Arjuna, I've told you all this stuff, and now it's up to you. You must reflect on everything I've said and then act as you see fit. And so, although in the end Arjuna says, I'll do as you command, there is still this option held out that it's completely up to us to figure it all out. And there is no right answer. There's only just being in the moment and seeing what we're called to do and actually being able to hear it. I think that's the thing that is hard to actually hear. And you're observing that, talking about, there's all this potential out there, but are we actually even open to it? Are we alert enough to it? In fact, it's almost not being alert. The radar only kicks in when things are quieter and subtler. Then there's all sorts of things that can come alive. And otherwise, we're sort of almost, there's this white noise that makes it impossible for any signals to come in.
Is something this is when you started out really alluding to mind as being something that's not in the brain, but in the brain and the body, and also in participation with the outside, the inside and out, and all of it is, minding. For me, mind is this whole experience, and this experience is quite rich. I've felt in the course of speaking myself sort of dropping in a little bit more, and sort of the thickness and volume of the space seems to grow as we participate more easily with it, I guess. And one thing that I wanted to bring today was just a reflection about my own yoga practice, which has really, I've noticed in the past 6 months, sort of, I went through this period of being really alienated from it because I had thought that it was going to get me through my traumatic relationship that I was in, and actually it was more of a coping mechanism at the time. And what I've been discovering is there's many ways to do yoga. And sometimes I can get down and I'm just going through the motions and it's the idea of it. And then a couple of weeks will pass and, I've picked up something emotionally that I'm not aware of, that hasn't been revealed. Smoke a joint with my girlfriend, perhaps. And then getting down on the mat and really not just stretching, but groaning and really feeling into using it, almost tantrically to get into the emotions in the body. And that has been, I've found myself crying after doing that recently. And so it's really like yoga when the heart is in it seems to be where my orientation is now. And with the heart being a sort of participation in the body and sort of allowing pain to come out in yoga and that sort of thing.
Sounds very powerful. And in some ways, a very personal thing that ultimately can't be taught. It can only be pursued. I mean, some guidelines from what you were saying could be drawn up, and the systematizing brain starts to think, how would I teach a class that way? But in the end, all that can really be said is there's an invitation, as you say, to feel more deeply into what's there. And sometimes people do try to teach yoga in this way in a group setting now, and it basically ends up being reduced to, just sort of make whatever shape you feel like and see how that feels. And in the end, I don't find that a very helpful thing to go to a room to have somebody else talk to me about. It's also very hard to do in a productive way with other people, and in a group setting when there is, however much the teacher pretends otherwise, still some structure, and you've got to be out the room in 60 minutes, etc. So I think ultimately yoga was never meant to be taught in this on a mat in groups in a class sequenced for a fixed period of time for money kind of a way. That's how it evolved in the 20th century. It was always something very different. And I mean, you use the word tantric. I think the whole philosophy of tantra, which often today gets associated particularly with just sort of feeling good in the body, it was, like all the earlier traditions, a way of going beyond the body, but it was to go beyond the body through the body without rejecting the body, and seeing therefore that the ultimate wisdom could be attained through the body. But obviously it's a more the path like the razor's edge is a metaphor that's often used in these teachings. It's very narrow, very steep-sided, very hard to stay on, because if ultimately the challenge is to go beyond this sort of identification with getting satisfied through stuff and trying to push away the stuff we don't like, the use of physical sensation and even ultimately things that make us feel really good to try and be part of that project can easily lead us astray into just using it as a way of getting pleasure. And there's no harm in pleasure, but unless we're able to be very skilled with it, that just keeps us spinning around the I want more cycle. And so Tantra is a really interesting tool if I think seen in this more like Bhagavad Gita's message. I mean, the Bhagavad Gita in that 11th chapter is really teaching a tantric philosophy of the divine is in everything, and therefore everything is a portal to it, and the inherent wisdom of the omniscient being is therefore also in all of it, including every cell of the body. So we can tap into that, and does sound very rich. And I think another thing that comes to mind, I tried to talk about this a bit in my book, but inevitably, I've written this book. It's short, as I was saying, and it's made up of like 100 very short chapters. They're like little blogs, 500 words. So I take each theme as influenced some aspect of yoga history and philosophy, and they're like elements that have been combined into different compounds at different times. And one of those elements is referred to chakras, and that's part of tantric philosophy. And strictly speaking, they don't exist. You can't cut open a corpse and find a spinning wheel with little Sanskrit syllables inside lotus petals floating around at various locations. So they were originally meant to be imagined. They were designed in the earliest tantric texts as blueprints for visualization practice. But the problem is that as soon as you start saying that in the modern era, people assume that, well, that's debunked them. And that only really happens if we assume a separation between mind and body. Like they have to either exist in the body that we can cut open, or they're an invention of the mind. But what if the mind is the body, as we've been talking about? Then they're real, but in a different kind of a way. They're real in the sense of an intentionality makes them manifest, and then an understanding takes place. So I often think that's actually what yoga practice is, what you just described. Bringing this sort of, a container is created in which a particular engagement with being can take place. And it's only through the discipline of doing it that happens. And yet it can be as unstructured as you were describing, and as sort of free flowing as allowing it to direct itself from what's felt. And yet there's still a structure and a discipline involved in undertaking that. Otherwise it would just be you smoke the joint and you lie on the couch and sort of stuff comes and goes. And there's something about yoga that isn't just stuff comes and goes. It's a container within which one can watch what comes and goes, and therefore become a little less caught up in the coming and going, and a bit wiser as a result of watching the coming and going, and yet not having to stand back and watch, still able to participate. I think that's the dichotomy that I often used to find myself caught up in, was surely we're either just living and embroiled in stuff and it has all these effects on us, or we're totally standing back and watching. And the yoga tradition has mainly been about standing back and watching, and the Gita talks about getting involved, but then ultimately, as I say, sort of has its own master plan, doesn't leave much space for the standing back and watching and inventing your own, although as a 21st century reader, that's what we'll do. But still, I think that's where the juice is somehow being able to watch while doing.
Thank you, Daniel. I've really enjoyed this. I know you've got to jump off any moment now, but yeah, beautiful elucidation of the musicality of yoga there, I think. And
thank you for inspiring it. I'm amazed an hour has gone by. It's been a pleasure to share ideas.
Yes, and would love to, maybe in 6 months, maybe it'll be next year. Maybe we'll keep this going for a long time. But it's really nice to check in. And yes, Truth of Yoga by Daniel Simpson. Check it out. It'll be linked in the info below. Thanks very much, Daniel.
Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, take care. All the best with everything, and I look forward to next time.
Thank you very much, Daniel.